Like many photographers and filmmakers who are in their kind of early stages, when I was starting out, I was really into vintage lenses, primarily because they were really cheap. I always like to oogle the really fancy, expensive lenses like Sony G Masters and such, but originally I was nowhere near the budget for those, so vintage was the closest I could get to achieving that look without spending a ton of money. Really early on, I got super lucky with a thrift store find and found this lens that I've never heard anyone else talk about. I love that lens so much that I still use it all the time. I've actually bought 2 more just to make sure that I always have one that's in good shape that I can use on professional shoots. And today, I'm going to tell you all about it. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. It's me again, Seth, and I'm really excited to talk about the lens that I'm going to share with you today because I've actually been meaning to make this video for a long time. I kind of held off because I didn't think a lot of people would watch it, but I was using this lens again yesterday, and I did an entire kind of like shoot for a little short project that I was working on for fun using just this lens. It just blew me away, and every time I take it out, it does that. So I decided today was a good day to share it with you. When I first started getting really into photography and filmmaking, I was living in Portland, Oregon. There's a ton of Goodwill stores there, and there was one kind of close by to me, and I went in there and found just this massive selection of old lenses, most of which were just totally destroyed in really bad condition. But every once in a while I'd go in there and I would find something really awesome. Like over the years, if you're familiar, I found some Super Tacomars in there, and even found like a Canon FD f1.2 50 mil, which is not a common lens. I didn't buy that one because it was in really rough shape, but it was still a cool find nonetheless. And one day I stumbled across this guy. And this would be the Makinon 28-80 f3.5. And before we go any further, I want to point out this is the f3.5. There is also a Makinon 28-80 f3.5 to f4.5, which I also bought, and it's terrible. But this lens is great. The first thing I used this lens for was actually a Grand Canyon trip that I did a few years back. At the time I had a Sony a6400, and I was doing a 21-day trip down the Grand Canyon. Unfortunately, a 21-day Grand Canyon river trip and road tripping can be really hard on a really old metal lens. So this is that same lens today. It's got some scratches. The lens is pretty beat up, like around the filter ring. It's all smashed in. I mean, this thing has kind of been through the ringer. And surprisingly, the optics still look really good. You can't really see the scratches in any of the shots. Everything still looks the way I want it to, but I wanted something that I could use on shoots that would look good. So I got on the internet, and interestingly enough, I found another one on the Goodwill auction site at that. And I got this one for about 15 bucks. So spent about 10 bucks on this one, 15 on this one, 25 bucks in. I got 2 lenses. This one, however, had a little bit of dust on the inside, and if any of you have ever used the Goodwill auction site, which you should if you're looking for old lenses for really cheap, you know you can't really return stuff. So even though this one looks a lot better on the outside than that one did, still kind of didn't feel right to me. So I got on the internet again, and I found this beauty on Etsy, which is in immaculate condition. I've kind of added a focus ring and such on it so I can use it for video shoots. And that'll cost me about 80 bucks. So all in on all 3 of these lenses, I'm in about 105 bucks, which is about the price of one good vintage lens. So obviously it's really cheap. Why on earth would I own 3 of the same lens? What lens could possibly be that good that I would want to have it 3 times? First of all, let's talk about the fact that this is a zoom lens, 28-80, with a set aperture of f3.5. So it's not a variable aperture. When I zoom in, it doesn't change apertures, right? So like most cheap lenses that are zooms, you're gonna start at your, whatever wide, 24, let's say. And as you zoom in, you get to like, 70, 75, 100, whatever it is, you're gonna be at 4.5 or at 5.6 or whatever. And this lens doesn't do that. It stays at f3.5, which is huge, especially when you're shooting video. If you want to slowly zoom in, you stay at the same aperture instead of your shot getting darker and, less depth of field. It's going to stay the same. And that is a big deal if you're making videos. And it's usually something that'll cost you quite a bit more. For example, I have a Sony 24 to 105 f4, and that lens is, I don't know, somewhere around $1,000, maybe a little more. So quite a step up in price. Of course, there are loads of other features that make that lens more expensive, but you get the point. I would say this is, a comparable feature to an inexpensive, Cine zoom, which is going to cost you anywhere from $2,000 up. Beyond that, it has this look. A lot of people these days add haze filters to their lenses to give it kind of this soft cinematic feel, and every single one of these three has had that just built into it. If I add a haze filter, it's almost too much. And I'm not saying it's not sharp. It's not a soft look. It maintains its sharpness when I'm using focus peaking. Everything that's in focus is very red. It's almost sharper than a lot of the other lenses that I use, but it just has this very cinematic haze to it that I absolutely love in a lens. And this is the only one I've really been able to find that's an even remotely reasonable price that just looks like that. Speaking of its kind of built-in look, it also does some really amazing lens flares, which for me is huge. I love a lens with character, something that's going to spice up the shot a little bit, and I can pretty intentionally use this lens to get really big, beautiful flares, play with light, and make some really cool looks. I will say that is really only good when it's wide open at f3.5. It does have an 8-blade aperture, which means that as you stop it down, the bokeh is going to get kind of octagonal shaped. So will the lens flares, which I don't like as much. But wide open at 3.5, pop an ND filter on there, you get some really good depth of field, and you get some really cool characteristics to spice up your shots. Speaking of the bokeh, it has kind of that unique vintage just flair to the bokeh. People talk about lenses like the Helios 44-2 that do like the crazy swirl of bokeh, and that kind of happens in some parts of the focal range with this lens. I will say with the 44-2, it is also that way. It's not just like every shot has swirl of bokeh. It's only kind of at certain points in its focal range that you'll see that. Even yesterday, I was kind of messing with this shot, and I was kind of far away from the subject, and it started getting even like another kind of weird flare in the bokeh that I hadn't seen before. It almost looked like the edges of an anamorphic shot. So it has a lot of this really cool character to its bokeh that once again just adds more to the shot and makes it look different than all of the modern really sharp lenses do. Another really cool feature of it actually has internal zoom. So right now I'm at 28 and now I'm at 80. That'll also make you notice this is typically where your focus ring would be on the outside. It's actually backwards on this lens. This is your zoom ring and this is your focus ring. That said, the focus ring is not internal. So as I focus, it does get a little longer. That's the entire length of the focus throw right there. So that's kind of another thing that's really nice if you're shooting video. Having that short focus throw makes it really easy to adjust, which is huge when you're focusing manually. So once again, some of the kind of things you would get on like a nice cinema lens already built in here. I've also really been loving the f3.5 aperture. That's not really a speed that you see most lenses set at. Usually you have like f4 or you have f2.8 or something faster than that. I often feel that f4 is not quite fast enough, like my 24 to 105, especially when I'm backed off of a subject. You just don't really get much depth. And I've been surprised the difference that the f3.5 makes while still being easy to focus. It's easy to keep the subject in focus. Whereas if you're shooting like f1.4 or f2, it can actually be really tricky. So I can pretty much sum all of that up to say this lens does a lot of things that a lot of people pay extra money for in cinema lenses to achieve. It has that hazy look, it has the cool bokeh, it does great lens flares, but instead of paying a bunch of money, you can get one if you're lucky for $10 and definitely for under 100, which all boils down to the greatest part of this lens, which I've already mentioned a million times, which is the price. If you get online, you can find one for about $30, maybe 40, that's in really good shape. You might get lucky and stumble across one at a pawn shop or something, but they're kind of uncommon, so I wouldn't go looking for them there. Now that I've talked about how amazing it is, there are a few things that aren't great about it, just like with any cinema lens. However, that lens is surprisingly short. It is pretty heavy. I would say it's a big lens, but considering everything that it does, it's actually quite small. This is just the lens by itself. This is one with an adapter to go to my Sony E-mount. So, that's really, like, compared to, I don't know, here's a Helios 44-2, for example. Doink. And then this is the Makinon. This is a lens that just does one focal length, and this goes from 28 to 80. So I really don't think that it's actually that bad. I had my notes say that, oh, it's big, but it's really not that big for everything it does now that I think about it. But it is heavy. Kind of feels like you have a brick in your hand. The more that I do film type stuff, the more that my camera build gets heavier. And I've kind of learned from other people that when you're shooting with lenses that aren't stabilized and you're holding, a whole rig handheld, having it heavier actually kind of takes away a lot of that shake. When you have a really small camera and it's really light, every little bit of that shake in your hand or your arm translates into the camera. Whereas when you have this very heavy rig, you literally you can't shake as much. Like your shakes get slowed down. It kind of looks better. So that's something that used to bug me about it. And like if I'm shooting on something like my A7C just like this, I probably won't actually use this lens with this setup because it's cumbersome. And at that point, you really feel the weight. But when I'm shooting on my full rig, it doesn't really bother me. And the other thing, it can be kind of hard to find these. The biggest thing is that when you initially look for them online, I can guarantee you're going to see a ton of the 3.5 to 4.5. Once again, the big deal being there that those are not a set f3.5 aperture. They will be swinging as you zoom in from f3.5 to f4.5. And I also just felt like they didn't look anywhere near as good. The image quality wasn't as good. The build quality didn't feel as good. So you really want to make sure you're looking for this exact lens. I'll actually try and leave a link to this one in the description if I can find one. I think there's some on eBay, so try and leave one down there for you. Just something else worth noting, there are different mounts that you'll find these in. The first one that I got, this guy, yeah. The first one I bought, the one that survived the Grand Canyon, was a Pentax K mount. So just meaning I have to have a PK to NEX adapter for it. And then the other two are Canon FD mounts. I've, heard from a lot of people that when you have old lenses like this, some of the mounts, the build quality or the image quality was better than others. I haven't really seen a difference in the images between the old PK mount and the FD mount. They seem kind of the same to me. But if you're being really nitpicky, you might see some changes there. Everything I'm doing these days is with the FD mount version. So anything you see that's newer in this video that's not from the Grand Canyon is probably going to be from that. All of that is to say, I have tried dozens of vintage lenses over the years, partially due to that sweet Goodwill store that had shelves full of them. A lot of them are awful. A lot of them are great. These days, everyone is talking about the Helios 44-2. I've had one of these for years, and I do love this lens, but they've gotten, with their popularity, a bit more expensive. Not to say $100 isn't a totally reasonable price to pay for a lens this good, but $100 for a lens that only shoots one focal length seems kind of like a lot when you can pay $30 and get a lens that does a lot more. Really, you should just have both. So you have a great prime to do fast shots, and then you have a great zoom for a little bit of variety, but whatever. If I could only buy one, it would actually be the Makinon. And that's because I've used it on multiple shoots as the only lens. I've tried shooting with just the Helios, and it's a lot more work because when you're at one focal length, you have to move to account for that. If you want a wider shot, you have to go way over there. And then if you want a close-up shot, you got to get in really tight with your subject. And with a 28 to 80, I don't have to do that. I can just zoom out if I want to be wide, and I can zoom in if I want to be tight. So really big fan of this lens. And that's it. That's going to do it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to like and subscribe. We're getting pretty close to that 1,000 subscribers, which means I can monetize, and that'll give me time and budget to make more of these videos, which is awesome because I actually like making these. So yeah, subscribe if you haven't. I think for a bit we're going to be doing some water content. We'll have some more gear reviews on camera gear coming up. If you've got questions about the Makinon, let me know. If you need to find a link to one, just comment. Like I said, I'll leave a link in the description, but it might be sold. Who knows? So I'll try and hunt one down for you. Make sure you get the right one because I don't want you to get the 3.5 and 4.5 and be bummed out. That's it. That's it for today's video. The end. See you later. What other stuff do people say for bye? Tell me, that's what you can comment. Tell me how you say bye to people when you're trying to be fun and exciting. I need some things to say so I can keep my videos different than the last ones. Okay.